Let's take a look at a few absolute value examples. Here's our first example. We'll have the absolute value of 7 minus 2 plus the absolute value of 2 minus 7. Now we remember from a previous video that the absolute value of a number will give you the distance that that number is from 0, and distance can never be negative, so anytime we have an absolute value, that quantity will wind up being non-negative, which means either 0 or positive. So let's see if we can figure out what these two absolute value terms are, and then we'll add those quantities together. So when we have the absolute value of 7 minus 2, that's not saying the absolute value of 7 minus the absolute value of 2. We actually have to figure out what 7 minus 2 is first, and then we'll take the absolute value of that quantity. And then the same thing for 2 minus 7. We would need to evaluate 2 minus 7 and then take its absolute value. So let's do that. 7 minus 2 is 5, so we'd have the absolute value of 5 plus the absolute value of 2 minus 7 is negative 5. All right, so now it's time to take absolute values. The distance that 5 is away from 0 is 5. So basically we drop the absolute value sign since this number is already positive. And negative 5, on the other hand, is 5 units away from 0. So the absolute value of negative 5 is also 5. And so really we have 5 plus 5, and we're going to write both of those without the absolute value symbols, so our final answer would be 10. Let's look at another example. Here we have what's called an equation that has what's called a variable in it. A variable is some unknown number. And so what we're trying to do is determine an x value such that if you took its absolute value, it would give you 4. Now these can get more complicated and larger. We won't really study absolute value equations in detail until much later in the course. This is just a light introduction. There's not going to be much algebra we're going to do. We're just going to basically just think of a number that if you took its absolute value would give you 4. Well, 1x could be 4, right? Because the absolute value of 4 is 4, but that's not the only number. There's another number whose absolute value is also 4. How about negative 4? The absolute value of negative 4, if x is negative 4, the absolute value of negative 4 is also positive 4. So you would actually get 2 solutions from this equation here. All right, here we go. Here's our next one. The absolute value of a number, the absolute value of x, is equal to negative 7. Now, again, when you think about the definition of absolute value, that's telling you the distance that x is away from 0, and this is saying that distance needs to be negative 7. I don't think that there's any quantity, if you took its absolute value, would give you a negative number, period, much less negative 7. And so this does not have any answers. There are no x's that would make the absolute value of x equal to negative 7. So if we wanted to write this solution as a set, we would write it either with just empty braces because there's no answers, or if you remember our video on the empty set, then you can also do a circle with a line through it, and that's basically a set of answers with nothing in it. There's no answers that will satisfy this equation here. All right, here's a couple of inequality problems. These can be a little bit challenging for students, especially when they start throwing in lots of negatives. Here we have negative, the absolute value of negative 19 is either greater than or less than the absolute value of negative 39. Now let's start with this one. What is the absolute value of negative 39? That's the distance that negative 39 is away from 0. So this will give you 39. And then the absolute value of negative 19 is positive 19. But don't forget, we have an additional negative to tack on once we're done. So this is actually negative 19. Now don't be fooled. Just because you have a negative and a negative doesn't automatically make this one a positive, because we also have to account for the absolute values here. The absolute value of negative 19 is positive 19, and then we tack on an additional negative. Now clearly, if this is positive and this is negative, then the 39 is greater than the negative 19, or you could say negative 19 is less than 39. All right, last example here, we have negative the absolute negative 7 is greater than or less than, not really sure, negative the absolute value of negative 10. Let's figure out what both of these numbers are. So the absolute value of negative 7 is positive 7, this quantity in green right here, because that's the distance that negative 7 is away from 0. And then we'll make that quantity negative. So we'll have negative 7. And then this absolute value of negative 10 will be positive 10, but then we attach an additional negative. Okay, now both of these are negative, so we might at some point even have to revert back to a number line. So if here's 0 and we have negative 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, negative 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whoops, negative 7 right here, negative 8, negative 9, negative 10, you'll remember on a number line, a number that's to the right of another number is the larger number. So in this case, negative 7 is larger than negative 10. So it's greater than negative 10 simply because it's to the right of negative 10 on a number line.